Ready to go? Thank you. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us at our 4th annual lecture of Alzheimer Society. I'm Fiona Carragher and I'm the Director of Research and Influencing, and I can't tell you how excited and delighted I am to be hosting this event in person this evening. So for those of you in the room, just a little bit of housekeeping. We don't expect a fire drill, but in the unlikely event of an evacuation, please take the stairs down and out through the front door, following the directions from the team here at the venue. So as I said, I'm Fiona and I have the privilege of leading our research and influencing work. And the work that we do is to push for breakthroughs and policy changes that will change the lives of those affected by dementia, not just now, but also in the future. Our teams, with our supporters, are a force for change. Now, I joined Alzheimer Society 3 years ago after 25 years in the NHS as a clinical scientist. I went from frontline services, working in laboratories at places like Guy's Hospital, to leading science and health policy at a national level. And in that time, I saw the difference that science and research could make, really driving massive leaps forward in our understanding and treatment of diseases, such as in cancer or in infectious disease. And you only have to look to see what's happened in the last year through COVID to see what research and science can do. So I have seen at first hand the difference that research can make to society. So it was clear to me through that time that dementia was the biggest health and societal challenge we were facing globally, and was something that science and research was ready to tackle. So when the opportunity came to join Alzheimer Society, I had to take it, and I haven't regretted a moment of the last 3 years. It's been a fantastic journey. So last year we hosted the event entirely online, and this year is our first fully hybrid one. So this is definitely the world of 2022. So I'm going to welcome everybody online. There's lots of you watching in the comfort of your own home. You'll be able to comment, to chat and interact with us through the whole evening. We're going to have question and answers at the end of the evening. So please do pop any of those questions that come up to you through the evening into the online throughout the evening, and we'll make sure that you're brought into those questions later on. And a really warm welcome to friends and supporters in the room this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you. And this year we're going to be focusing on diagnosis. We have a wonderful panel of speakers from across the research and medical community who will be discussing what we need to do to unlock support through better dementia diagnosis. Now, there have been many, many very difficult things through this last 2 years. People affected by dementia have, without doubt, been the worst hit. 1 in 4 of all deaths from COVID-19 have been from somebody with a pre-existing dementia diagnosis. And we know the impact of lockdown has been significant on those trying to access the normal care and support that they have. And there's also a hidden story, and that's of the family carers who've really had to keep things going through this last 2 difficult years. Many of them burnt out, on their knees, really struggling. But one of the things coming out of the COVID last 2 years has been that diagnosis rates have fallen to a 5-year low. And that's due to multiple reasons through this pandemic. But we are seeing now a sustained drop in dementia diagnosis for the first time ever. Alzheimer Society, we estimate that there's about 33,000 people living with dementia who would have been diagnosed at this point if the pandemic had not happened. So tonight's lecture comes at a real time of focus for Alzheimer Society. We will be launching our new strategy in the coming weeks. As we come out of the other side of this pandemic, and as I said, where people affected by dementia have been hit the hardest, we know that the most important thing to do is to listen to the voices of those affected by dementia more than ever. The number set to be living with the condition is set to rise, and this number always staggers me, but 102 million people worldwide within the next 20 years are expected to have dementia. I mean, that's just staggering when you think about the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And we know that we need to be diagnosing both earlier and more accurately if we want to really stand a chance of getting these breakthroughs in diagnosis and treatment. Diagnosis is a cornerstone of dementia research. It enables researchers to learn more about what's going wrong within the brain cells affected by the disease. It also enables critical research for new treatments, but also enables people to access those treatments at the right time when they become available. So this evening, we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to look back over the last 30 years of diagnosis research, and then we're going to look forward through the stories of our early career researchers about some of the exciting advances that we're expecting in the coming years. I'll then bring forward our expert panel who'll talk about this and answer your questions, and no question is silly or stupid at all. And what we want to do is be able to get us to a position where everyone eventually has an access to an early and accurate diagnosis. So to kick off this evening, we will be hearing from a great friend of Alzheimer's Society, Professor Nick Fox. Nick is Professor of Neurology and Director of the Dementia Research Centre at the Institute of Neurology, UCL, so very, very close to where we are this evening. He's also a group leader at the UK Dementia Research Institute, which Alzheimer's Society is proud to be a founding funder of. As I said, Nick has been a long-term supporter of Alzheimer's Society, and through research funded through us, started to make breakthrough discoveries in 1994 that changed the future course of dementia research. This research not only made the significance clear of an early diagnosis, but has paved the way for many future discoveries. So I'm really delighted to invite Nick this evening to give his keynote speech, The Challenges of Making a Diagnosis, 30 Years of Progress. Nick.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. That was very kind of you, and it's a great honour to be giving this Alzheimer's Society lecture, and it's a great pleasure to speak about something which I'm absolutely passionate about. The title of my talk really goes to the heart of what I think Fiona was talking about there, the importance of a diagnosis and how that can be challenging, and how I do think we are making progress, but we've still got a long way to go. I'd like to thank a number of people. I'd like to thank the Alzheimer's Society in particular for funding my clinical fellowship, taking a gamble. I must have done the worst interview that I've ever been part of, and they still gave me a fellowship. They must have been desperate. It certainly changed the course of my life and career. I'm very grateful for all of you to be here, and those online. Thank you for all those who fundraise for, support, contribute to the Society, because the Society does an amazing job of supporting researchers, and probably does a bit of conversion therapy, because I certainly got converted to be an Alzheimer's Society a researcher, and got into dementia research in a way that I would never have imagined. But I'd particularly like to thank the patients and families that I've had a true privilege of working with, and they are just incredibly generous in their commitment to research, with a complete expectation that their research will not be helping them, but will be helping future generations, and that's amazing. So where does this journey start? I was going through my mum's effects a few years ago, and I came across, she'd kept the edition of the Alzheimer's Disease Society newsletter then, back from April 1993, and I'm pleased you probably won't be able to see properly. Second from the left there is a very earnest and very young looking, not quite so many grey hairs, Nick Fox, and the Society took an amazing gamble. This was their first research fellowship funding, and they funded 4 of us, and there we are on the announcement of it. And my research was, and I'm going to come back to this, was around using magnetic resonance imaging, brain scans, to try and detect the earliest changes in Alzheimer's disease, to try and see whether we could understand more about the disease as a result of looking into that, but also to try and improve diagnosis, which I'll come back to. So what's the challenge? And Fiona touched on this, but I mean, the figures are totally staggering. Over 850,000 people in the UK living with dementia. Absolutely devastating for families. Alzheimer's disease and other dementias do not affect individuals, they affect whole families. And anybody here in this room or watching online who has some experience of that knows that. But they're massive impacts on society, on our health and our social care systems. Fiona pointed out an important COVID statistic just a moment ago. There's another one which is equally shocking. If you look at the number of people who died with dementia since the beginning of the pandemic, it's more than the number of people who died of COVID. And that's year on year. So, but the devastation is not just about it being the leading cause of death in the UK now. It's about the fact that it accounts for 3/4 of those people in residential care. And I'm afraid, I haven't done any cognitive tests on anybody, just to reassure you, but 1 in 3 of us in this room will spend our final days with dementia. And a half of us, which I think is the most frightening number, will care for somebody, look after somebody that we care deeply about. So it's an amazingly important problem, but then I guess you wouldn't be listening to me if you didn't already slightly believe that. And a lack of diagnosis is a great source of distress, as well as being really important for research, as Fiona mentioned. And people often don't understand fully why that can be so difficult. And I'm going to try and put that into some context. Importantly, there are many, many causes of dementia, and there are many mimics. And we desperately need to improve diagnosis as well as care and support. And that is also critical to us unlocking better therapies. So I'm going to set the context a little bit. What is dementia and what it's not? It's not just aging. For one of the reasons diagnosis, particularly when I started my research, was actually difficult for people to get, was because there was a prevalent view that, well, it's kind of normal, isn't it? It's just getting a bit old, senile, a bit soft, all these dreadful terms. It's absolutely not just aging. And it's not a single disease. It's a non-specific syndrome of many causes. And I'm going to come back to that. But nobody, pretty much nobody, is immune. Doesn't matter whether you hold high political office or are tremendously physically able. I mean, we have 3 different dementias, from trauma-related, Alzheimer's disease, and vascular disease. So what do we mean by dementia? As I said, it's a very non-specific, it's actually a pretty rubbish term. Derivation-wise, it means simply out of mind, dementia. It's no more meaningful than saying brain failure. And what's shocking is how many people are diagnosed with dementia. We don't diagnose dementia, we shouldn't be using that term. We detect dementia and we diagnose the cause. Imagine if you went to your doctor, and this really takes us back 50 years, and they said, right, you've got cancer. Bye-bye. The shocking thing is now that would be totally unacceptable. It's what was told to my grandmother about my grandfather, but it's totally unacceptable to do that now. You'd say, well, where is it? You know, what stage is it? What are the treatments? What are notes? All sorts of things. We are 20, 30 years behind cancer in so many ways, and this is one. People are still being given a diagnosis of dementia just really bad, like being told, if it wasn't a fancy doctor's word, it was just told brain failure. There are many causes, and that's really important for us to make progress in research, but also to tell people about the future and what that holds for them, to be able to understand that. So what does this umbrella term mean? And in a way, if you can think about it as disconnection on many levels. At the cellular level, what dementia means, it's a loss of brain function, and that's because of a loss of brain cells and a loss of the connections between them. Pretty much everybody in this room, again, I'm not making any personal comments, each of you have about 80 billion neurons. So that's 10 times as many as the people on this planet. And each of those neurons is making hundreds and thousands of connections. So this is an exquisite bit of biological engineering. And those connections are what make us think, make us what we are. And the brain and those connections are incredibly complex, and they're also very sensitive. They're very easy to damage, and there are multiple ways it can be damaged. I also think, without stretching the analogy too far, I hope, that dementia is also a loss of connection with oneself, with one's past, lose your memory. It often leads to a loss of connection with the wider society, and ultimately, and most sadly of all, a loss of ability to connect with the people who are our loved ones who care most about us. So we need to find better treatments, and in order to do that, we need to improve diagnosis, and we need to recognize that we have to find treatments for a cause. There would not be a treatment for any single cancer now if we treated all cancers the same and put people into trials. There'd be no treatment for any of the infections if we treated all infections the same. Imagine trying to use antibiotics on any infection. So what are these causes? Well, the majority are what we term neurodegenerative. That just means that brain cells degenerate. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause, and these are currently relentlessly progressive without effective treatments, at least not effective treatments to slow the disease. But some causes of dementia are not progressive. Brain trauma, sudden strokes, and that's very important to make that distinction. And some are treatable, some are reversible. Infections. Some parts of the world, HIV dementia is one of the most common causes of dementia. And a few hundred years ago, it would have been syphilis. Vitamin deficiencies, thyroid function, these are really important treatable things that we mustn't miss, and therefore we cannot lump everybody together as just having dementia without something more precise. So the most important causes, Alzheimer's disease does not equal dementia. Alzheimer's disease is one cause of dementia. It's the most common cause. There are other causes which are, like Alzheimer's disease, characterized by the accumulation of certain proteins. And you'll hear a bit more about these proteins in later speakers' talks. And these proteins build up, and they are the diagnostic hallmarks of the disease, and they damage cells. And then we have dementia with Lewy body with a different protein and several different proteins involved in frontotemporal dementia, and then vascular dementia. But there are all these other things, from head injury to alcohol-related dementia to brain tumors to infections. And it's important that we make a difference. So going back 30 years, why was the diagnosis so difficult? I think part of it was nihilism, a belief that you couldn't make a diagnosis. Doctors didn't feel that they had proper tests. They couldn't just send somebody off for a blood test or a lumbar puncture or a brain scan and get an answer. So that makes the doctor's job difficult. And there was also a sense then, which I hope we're starting to change, that there was no point. People wouldn't want to know. There was nothing you could do differently. And that's so wrong. And I'd be delighted to take further questions on that. You wouldn't get away tonight if you got me started on all the reasons why we need to make a diagnosis when people want it. Not least because, and I really remember when I first started my Alzheimer's Society Fellowship, I went and talked different branches of the Alzheimer's Society around the country. And I remember one man picking me up from a station. It was Sheffield. I still remember it. And he, in his car, driving me to where I was to give my talk, he knew I was going to talk about my work on diagnosis, and he said, you know what's worse is the agony of not knowing. And that stayed with me. That sense that his wife had been told that it was the menopause, that it may be marital problems, that it was depression, and that was devastating for him and for them, and they couldn't get any support. So it matters because there are treatments. There are treatments for Alzheimer's disease. We shouldn't be denying people that. There's management of risk factors, there's provision of information, planning for the future when you still have that ability. Support, benefits, legal, I could go on. And it's critical for research. As I said, we won't find therapies if we lump all of dementia together. It's just not going to happen. So back to my fellowship. Having set the context a little bit, So I was trying to understand earliest changes in Alzheimer's disease, and I need to give you a little bit of a primer on Alzheimer's disease. So Alois Alzheimer, the man on the left there, had a patient called August D. And those of you who like to make sort of spooky connections, the initials were AD as well. She had a young onset dementia, turned out to be Alzheimer's disease, and he studied her, and he examined the brain, and they had these lumps of protein and these tangles within brain cells, lumps of protein outside, and that one is called amyloid, and this is a modern image. He did a pretty good job, didn't he? Just looking down the microscope, and these are the tangles. So these are amyloid plaques, and these are tau tangles. But he also, and this will be the subject of what my research was about, noted that the brain itself was shrunken, reflecting the loss of brain cells. And what I was to do was to look at brain imaging to see whether we could pick up this loss of brain volume. So CT scans and MRIs have been around for a while, and it gave you the ability not to wait till death, which is only when diagnosis of the disease that caused the dementia could have been made previously, but you could see brain pathology in life, or at least you could see its effects on brain shrinkage. So that pathology, this is somebody who came to our clinic, that's a brain tumor that if it only had been picked up a bit earlier, that young woman would have survived. She was diagnosed with dementia elsewhere, and she hadn't had a scan. So you need to exclude these causes that are treatable, but they're the tiny minority, realistically. What we can see now with modern imaging techniques is exquisite detail, down to a millimeter resolution. That's the thickness of your thumbnail, which is just amazing. And what we try and do is see if we can pick up patterns. This is Alzheimer's disease with really destruction of the areas to do with memory, hippocampus here, and I'll come back to that, but generalized loss as well. But you can have focal losses, which are very, very different in terms of what the future holds in the treatments. This is frontotemporal dementia, front of the brain being particularly affected. So by the time somebody comes along to get see me or somebody else in clinic, their hippocampus, this memory area, is shrunk by about 10, 15, 20% compared to normal. So the question then was, how could you pick up changes earlier than that? Could we make diagnosis, because it's often a slow process before getting a diagnosis. And one of the problems was that there's quite an overlap. The hippocampus might look a bit small, but you didn't know whether somebody had been born with that. So it can be tricky. So how would you pick up the earliest changes? And that's where those families I mentioned come in, because the first gene for Alzheimer's disease had been found a couple of years earlier. Actually, some funding from the Alzheimer's Society was critical to that. And that meant that we could see people. We'd known for over 100 years that there were families where a gene caused the disease early, caused Alzheimer's disease. And it would be passed on to 50% of that individual's children. Half of their children would get the same disease. And this is just a family tree going through the generations. The dark filled in circles and squares are women and men who had become affected with Alzheimer's disease. And very generous individuals like this lady here, who was well, went into my research. And the idea was, how could we pick it up earlier? We'd need to study people from before they became affected. And the only way you could do that, you couldn't scan thousands of people without knowing that they were at high risk. But these families were at high risk. Each individual had a 50% chance of becoming affected at about the same age as their parent. So that gave us a way in. And my job was to measure the hippocampus. That was what my fellowship was. And let me tell you, you sit in a darkened room looking at a big screen, and the brain scan is basically slices through the brain, lots of slices. And the hippocampus is a long, irregular structure. It might have 20, 30 slices. And there I would sit in front of a computer, the mouse, and try and draw around this. And your eyes would go a bit funny. And it could take you an hour to draw around one hippocampus. And annoyingly, people have got two. There's one on the left and the right. So it took twice as long. And I thought, right, I'll do this. We know this is involved. The pathologists have told us that shrinks really, in everybody with Alzheimer's disease. So if I just draw around it carefully enough, I'll be able to pick up change. That's one of my drawings. It's really hard. And what I found, so I thought, got all these results, and then I tested myself on my repeatability. So I tested it again a few weeks later, and they were all different. I couldn't do it reliably. And even worse, when I looked at my results, the people who were already affected, so I knew that there was hippocampal shrinkage, overlapped with the people who were not. So there was a problem. So I thought, well, maybe if I could see change over time, because now, a little interactive bit here. Can you look at whoever's sitting next to you and look at the size of their hand? Who's got a larger hand? Okay. Does that mean your hand is shrinking? Because that's what we're doing with these scans. We're saying the hippocampus is a bit small, so it's shrunk. Because there's so much biological variability. And anybody's worried about a shrinking hand, see me afterwards. So that was the problem. You couldn't take a measurement unless it was really shrunken. I mean, if somebody's got a really shrunken hand, come and see me afterwards. But then you'd be able to make a diagnosis. But otherwise, it looked like within the normal variation. So I thought maybe what we could do is we could take serial measurements, take a scan and then another scan. And that way, we would know that there'd been a change, because that's fundamental about degeneration, loss. Now, here's the visual aid. I was thinking I should bring you in a brain and slice it up in front of you, but there's Human Tissue Act and health and safety, so they wouldn't like that. So I thought, what could I do that would show you what the problem was? So I brought 2 parsnips. Now, the human hippocampus is much more complicated than these. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see, somebody has a first scan, and they've got a hippocampus like that. And then they've got another scan a year later, and they've got a hippocampus like that. Now, those of you not too far away, which one's bigger? Well done. You get the extra canapé at the end. But the problem is you don't see it as a volume like that within a brain scan. You saw what I was having to do there. What you've actually got is measurements based on little slices. This is one I prepared earlier. And how you slice that irregular structure depends upon what you measure. And so I was seeing people, they have serial scans, and I was thinking, I'm sure this is smaller than the other one, but I could never get it quite aligned. I wasn't getting the same. If you imagine somebody going into a scanner, they wouldn't be in exactly the same position. And around that time, to try and get people in the same position, they would put sort of almost halos with screws on. But if you, again, next interactive bit, if you just move your scalp like this, do you realize, so no matter, even if they did tether the scalp, the brain could move relative to the scalp. So that didn't help. And the eureka moment for my research was thinking, well, you'll work it out. So how do you measure these small changes accurately if the person is positioned in a scanner differently and the slices are taken differently in a different orientation for a small structure? So you might want to measure the hippocampus on this scan. You draw around it lots of times, and then you try and do that there. There is change there, by the way, but it might not have, with my measurements, might not have been picked up. So this is where my daughters come in, who generously, I have their permission, by the way, to show this. They're quite a bit older now. To tell a difference, how do 2 school children decide in the playground who's taller? They stand back to back. They know that they'll make an error measuring with a measuring ruler or something like that. So the thought was, could you do the same with brain scans? Could you take a brain scan? Don't worry about whether somebody goes into the right position in the scanner. Stop thinking about it as slices, but thinking about it as a volume. And they get a computer to position exactly on top of the other, the second brain on the first. Overlay it, and then subtract it. And basically, the brain, this is a little known fact, the brain was designed for registration, this positional matching. Well, not sure if you believe in evolution or God, that was quite what it was designed for. But what it was is because it's such a complex shape, there's only one match. So if you'd wanted whose hand was larger, without looking at it, you could have put them on top of each other and you'd have seen. And so that's how that would work. If you match the two scans, can you see a difference? So here's somebody in one of my families, and the first scan actually the first few scans were me. I'd go in the scanner, and it still makes the hair on the back of my arms stand on edge to remember seeing the scan amazingly well matched. First scan, a scan a year later. Now, have I cheated and just put the same scan in twice? Do you see any difference between those two? What you may see is a little bit of change here. That's the ears, because you're looking at a scan like this. So there's the brain almost looking out at you. And the person went into the scanner with foam pads positioned slightly differently. So the brain, which is what the computer's trying to do, is perfectly matched. And you can see even this complex structure is perfectly matched, and there is no change there. And this is somebody who was from one of the families who was about to give up his job because he was worried about his memory. He was the same age as his dad. We were able to tell him there's absolutely no change. Compare that with this. Just over a year. This is a devastating disease. It's not aging. You're losing brain over just a year, and it's progressive. 18 months, 36 months, 42 months. Relentlessly progressive, and it's not just the hippocampus, it's throughout the brain. If you talk to anybody who knows somebody with Alzheimer's disease, it's not just memory. And what we could do is we could then measure these changes, and we could see not just that there were changes early on, but they were progressive from several years earlier. We could say that Alzheimer's disease, in terms of brain shrinkage, started about 5 years before symptoms. Now, that may seem frightening, but it opened up a window for not just diagnosis, but for treatments going in when we have most to save and when we might most want it. This long pre-symptomatic period has gone into helping us understand the disease and diagnosis, but it also became a technique that was used in clinical trials trying to see whether there was change. And over 30 clinical trials use these techniques, and many more do now, to see if we can track whether therapy is slowing the shrinkage. And 10 years later, just to introduce what other people are going to talk about, there were new techniques using PET scanners, which could look at the proteins, not just the shrinkage. And that then extended that pre-symptomatic period. This is a PET scan looking at amyloid. The hot colors are amyloid, that protein I told you about, in somebody who's got Alzheimer's disease and somebody who's just worried about their memory but hasn't there. And this then opened up that window, not just to 5 years, but perhaps to 20. So there's this long pre-symptomatic period. We now not only can track volume changes, and MRIs can look at the difference between FTD and Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, but we now can scan for the particular proteins that Alzheimer saw over 100 years ago. But we need to do much better. Thank you very much.
Gosh, anyone else blown away? That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. And I have to say, I haven't heard quite that story all told together, and it's got my scientific mind racing, I have to say. So taking us right up to the future now, I have to say thank you, Nick, but we're going to be talking to some of our early career researchers. And I'm really delighted to bring to the stage two of our brightest early career researchers, Dr. Antoinette O'Connor and Dr. Ashwin Ventakara. I'm not going to get this right. Venkataraman. Sorry. So our early career research programs funds just the best people for the future. So these budding researchers who really want to make their career, just like Nick, throughout in dementia. Without funding, and we've certainly faced a really difficult 2 years, many researchers would be forced to leave research early in their careers, and we'd lose their talent, but we'd also lose the potential breakthroughs like we've heard from Nick already. And there's no doubt that it has been thanks to our supporters, and certainly thanks in these last 2 years, that researchers like Antoinette and Ashwin are able to continue in their absolutely fantastic research and push the next steps of our diagnosis research further. So that's why I'm so excited to hear tonight from both Antoinette and Ashwin, who are going to tell us about, what can we do to enable a smoother and much more effective and efficient diagnosis of dementia, or the diseases that cause dementia in the future. So firstly, over to Antoinette.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. It's a real honour. So I'm a clinical research fellow working at UCL, and I've actually had the privilege of being supervised by Nick over the last 3 to 4 years, and also working with those same families that he mentioned. And none of that would have been possible without the Alzheimer's Society, who funded me, and I'm so grateful. I throughout medical school, I worked as a care assistant, and I got to see firsthand the devastating impact of dementia, and that kind of fueled my desire to go into research and to improve access to diagnostics. And it's been a real privilege to work in the field at this time and see the progress that has been made, and I'm going to just show you some of that this evening. So my talk today will be on using blood tests to detect and predict Alzheimer's disease, which is the major focus of my research, which was kindly funded by the Alzheimer's Society, and I did that at the Dementia Research Centre just over the road. So this is just a bit of background, and you'll recognize these pictures from Nick's talk. So as we've seen, there's at the very beginning and the description of Alzheimer's disease at the beginning of the 1900s, and then our evolution of understanding what exactly was driving this, and these abnormal proteins of amyloid and tau. And then we, as Nick has said, we're able to detect these through new techniques like PET scanning, where we can see here in the pictures the brain of abnormal proteins being detected, and also through lumbar punctures, where we were able to detect these degenerative proteins. But these techniques, while amazing and have really revolutionized our understanding of disease, are not without their faults. They're invasive, they're expensive, and with PET scanning, there's associated radiation exposure. And what I really wanted to focus on was blood biomarkers, which are somewhat of a holy grail in dementia diagnosis. They're, easy, they're repeatable, they're cheap, and they can be widely used even in low resource settings. And I was fortunate to start research in around 2017, when there was a real explosion of exciting research. And you can see here all the headlines, and basically over time our analysis techniques have improved. So, our detection platforms are 1,000 times more sensitive than what we were using 10 years ago. So things that we could never imagine measuring in blood, we can now start to reliably detect. So I'm going to just show you some of those amazing advances we've done, and how we can use these blood tests to move away from a dementia diagnosis to diagnosing the actual underlying disease pathology using a blood test, and then being able to give people an accurate diagnosis, prognosis test, and also design proper clinical trials where we have treating the disease, not at a really fine-grained level. So how do we do that? Well, Nick spoke a little bit about the familial Alzheimer's disease families, and actually this is the second snapshot of the Alzheimer's disease newsletter related. So we have all these folders in the Dementia Research Centre of all the families and all the paperwork over the years. And this is back from 1986 from one of the first family members who saw a note in the Alzheimer's Society about trying to gather together these families. And it was from this lady's letter that we have her family tree here on the right-hand side, that the first gene was detected, and we had this opportunity then to study Alzheimer's disease before symptom onset. And thus, Nick's already talking about this, but it's a really exciting opportunity because you can finally understand that clinically silent period, which opens up a treatment window. So using these families, using blood samples kindly donated by these families, we're able to see some really impressive results. So we see here on the right-hand side of the screen symptomatic carriers and how there's very little overlap between non-carriers in this measure called neurofilament light. Neurofilament light is a kind of measure of brain injury. It's slightly non-specific, but it's very useful as a test, and it has the potential to be kind of a treatment outcome measure. In trials in MS, where they have multiple sclerosis, where they have treatments for anti-inflammatories, we've seen that this measure can be used as a treatment response marker in clinical trials. And the hope is that we could potentially use this in future in clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease to assess treatment response. And it's really important because this isn't just a blood test. It also correlates to the real world outcome measures that matter to people. So it shows the correlations with structural change, so MRI measures like Nick discussed, and real life clinical outcome measures, as well as cognitive change. This biomarker is reflecting really important and meaningful outcomes. But then what about specific things? We talk about the need to finding the underlying pathology. And in Alzheimer's disease, we know that tau is a big driver. Can we detect tau? Well, this is some of my work in during my PhD, which suggested, yes, indeed we can. This is another plot here. So we see non-carrier family members, pre-symptomatic, so individuals who have the mutation but who don't have symptoms yet. And then symptomatic cases, so individuals who have developed symptoms of cognitive decline. And it's really, really remarkable in the symptomatics, the blood marker level is almost 3 times that of non-carriers. And there's amazing group separation. And interestingly as well, we see that these changes start before symptom onset, opening up a treatment window before treatment response or before symptom onset. And again, we found that this correlated with really important real-world outcome measures. It was associated with clinical change and cognitive change. And also then we saw, when did the changes start? And we saw that they began quite early in the disease, over a decade before symptom onset. And we saw that changes in this tau measure occurred around the same time as neurofilament light, the marker of brain injury. And this is important because it tells us when we need to be intervening. It shows us that we have a measure that we can assess treatment response with. And it also shows that tau is, definitely causing brain injury because we can see this marker rise. So it's important for understanding of the disease process. And then what about amyloid? So can we measure that? Well, it looks actually from our recent studies that we can quite reliably measure that in blood. And we see here again a plot where we see non-carriers on the left-hand side of the screen, and their levels are lower than individuals carrying the mutation. And also in a really interesting discovery, we found that the levels of this blood protein correlated with the predicted age at onset of these individuals, showing that amyloid was having a really deterministic impact on disease. And this, as we move towards an era of personalized medicine and targeted therapies, this is really exciting because you could imagine an individualized measure of outcome. So it could really revolutionize clinical trial design. So Nick spoke earlier about timely diagnosis, and I just want to echo that, the importance of these blood tests and how they can have not only real world, how can have impacts not only for research, but also in the real world clinical setting, because people want a diagnosis when they come to seek help. It protects them from harm, from inappropriate investigations, allows them time to access support and benefits, and allows involvement in decisions when people are most able to do so, as well as reducing anxiety and depression, as well as targeting early interventions when there's the best chance of success. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the amazing family members I have the opportunity to work with. And here in this picture is that amazing lady who wrote that letter to the Alzheimer's Society back in 1986, and her son who participates in our research. And it's without these families and without the Alzheimer's Society, we're so critical to setting this up, we wouldn't have made any of these diagnoses and progress. So thank you all.
Wow, it's absolutely lovely to be here, and I'm so grateful to the Alzheimer's Society for funding my clinical research training fellowship. So I'm Ash Venkatraman. I'm an old age psychiatrist in training, And through the Alzheimer's Society funds, I was able to do PET and MR brain imaging to understand the early changes in the disease. And I have clinical experience both in old age psychiatry and in cognitive neurology, and it's really interesting. I witnessed the disease firsthand in family, in my grandparents, and I've seen the burden on not just the individual, but everyone around the person suffering from the disease. And in my clinical practice, I see actually the most devastating symptoms are the depression. It's actually psychosis, it's hallucinations, it's delusions, it's all of the things, it's the agitation, it's the irritability, it's not just the memory, and it's all of these things combined. And I feel that that something has to be done to try and understand the underlying causes with the hope of making a meaningful change to everyone suffering from this. Day to day, I've been working at the UK Dementia Research Institute at Imperial College. This is a PET scanner, if you haven't seen one before. And with PET imaging, it involves looking at particular proteins or particular neurotransmitters in the brain. And you inject a contrast, which travels in the bloodstream to the brain. It gives off a signal, and that signal involves a positron. It's called a positron emission tomography. A positron annihilates an electron. It emits two perpendicular rays, and that's detected by that ring around the patient. And then you use some fancy computational reconstruction to reconstruct that image of the brain and where those proteins are, or where that neurotransmitter imbalance is, and find out how that is different from an individual with Alzheimer's compared to an individual without. So this is some of the work I did during my PhD, and I was looking at in the individual cell, I was looking at the batteries of the cell, which is on the left-hand panel. It's that oval-shaped thing, which is a mitochondria. I was looking at the batteries, which is called mitochondrial complex 1. I was looking at a cell response to stress, to environmental insult, and that was the sigma-1 receptor. And I was also looking at the connections in the synapses, called the presynaptic vesicle. And what I showed in my PhD was actually you get widespread cell stress and mitochondrial dysfunction in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease. And understanding these early changes may provide insights that allow us to develop better drugs targeting these systems in the future. I used a fair amount of machine learning or artificial intelligence, and that produces some of the plots like at the top panel. And you can get individual precise readouts from an individual patient in a few millimeters squared across the brain on how each of these systems are functioning. And then I used another form of machine learning or artificial intelligence to look at the whole system and how that varies from an individual who isn't forgetful, and then find out and project those areas in high resolution detail across all of these systems. The next thing I did was actually looking at amyloid, a necessary trigger in Alzheimer's disease, but by far not the only thing. And I used a form of machine learning to look at the distribution or the three-dimensional spread of amyloid across a large cohort of patients suffering from, well, who are cognitively well, through to mild cognitive impairment and early forgetfulness, through to Alzheimer's disease. And when you image the brain, it's like a 3D, it's like a Rubik's Cube, actually. And your brain fits within those boxes. And instead of pixels that you have when you photograph someone, you have voxels in three-dimensional space. And actually, some of my analysis was actually you string out that cube into individual lines, and then you train a machine to read the patterns in between the lines. And then you reconstruct those lines, and then you compare those lines to how forgetful someone is on cognitive tests. And then I devised an algorithm that is based on the amyloid spatial positioning and weighted for the cognitive tests, that when you input a scan, you get a diagnosis out, Alzheimer's or non-Alzheimer's. And then I compared that to other spatial methods that do the similar things. So these are some of the images of how the amyloid clusters that I found using artificial intelligence compare to other methods. And then I was able to test the diagnostic precision of this. So how well Alzheimer's is ruled in and how well Alzheimer's is ruled out. And actually the blue line is my method, and that's the further towards the top left-hand corner, the better the method is. And I was able to compare that against gold standard diagnoses and come up with an algorithm to automatically diagnose Alzheimer's disease. That's one tool amongst many. I was fortunate enough to be featured in the national newspapers a couple of weeks ago. And I showed my mum this story. She said, "Oh, at least you're on a page with Rishi Sunak." So, but she missed the point of my article, which is actually the promise of AI. And I firmly believe that the future of Alzheimer's and dementia diagnosis is about precision diagnostics. I think that machine learning can help with this. And we need to be able to combine not just neuroimaging markers, but multiple markers of forgetfulness, of cognition, with blood-based markers, with cerebrospinal fluid-based markers. And I mean, ideally, in a few years' time, we need precise subtype divisions. And wouldn't it be lovely if you had so much information that you could train a machine to read that information and say, actually, we can be certain about your subtype, and then actually your symptoms will start in 6 to 7 years. Your memory changes will start in 7 years' time. You might become a little bit depressed as a result of this in 9 years' time. And wouldn't it be lovely if we have a bespoke, tailored treatment to target those systems and those proteins that block those changes and have a 90% predicted probability of success if you initiate that at the right time in the right person to stop the disease or stop the symptoms or minimize the symptoms. And I hope we're working towards using artificial intelligence to predict both treatment response and also predict how well someone will respond to future treatments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ash and Antoinette. I hope that your mind is slightly blown about what the future's going and the hope for both simple blood tests that will enable a much, much easier diagnostic journey, but also the future of precision medicine and being able to really personalise our treatments to the individual. So we're going to move to our panel discussion, and our panel this evening is both going to discuss the challenges that we're facing today, these challenges of dementia diagnosis, and I've already talked about how our diagnosis rate is around 60% now across the country. We're also going to talk about what can be done for that bright future of that early and accurate diagnosis. But before I introduce our expert panel for the evening, we wanted to share with you some of the voices of people affected by dementia. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the evening, Alzheimer's Society is about to launch our new strategy, our new focus, re-energised coming out of COVID. What are we going to put the weight of the whole organisation and our supporters and partners behind? And that will be around diagnosis. And we've listened to hundreds of people affected by dementia with 61 different focus groups to find out what really, really mattered to them. And this video will show you just a snapshot of a few of those voices who will give those individual experiences of getting a diagnosis. So I'm hoping, Richard, you have that to share?
We struggled to get a diagnosis. He again was told that he had depression and anxiety. But because I'd been through a similar experience with my father, I could recognise the symptoms, and so we had to push for this diagnosis, and it took about 2 years.
So I was caring for my dad and providing them with a lot of information about our situation. So they should be providing me with help, not me helping them to understand us as a deaf family.
A lot of the services are heteronormative. We know that from the wider world. And as soon as you're thrown into a crisis like this, you need even more support to to reaffirm your identity, pointing you into the bits of information you need, but why not also point you to the specific LGBTQ services, like the Memory Cafe that's the Opening Doors London have, like the other ventures that are coming up with the LGBT Foundation and so on. That's, because I think for us as a minority, we especially need that kind of gentle entree to it all. And who better to say, look, we've had this experience, to look at your fellows in your community. It's not to deprive you from the wider community is the majority community, but what you don't want to do is to go into a setting where you're inhibited by the same things that make you inhibited in the wider world.
So just a small snapshot of some of the challenges that we know that people affected by dementia are facing now. And we're going to be discussing this and much, much more with our panellists this evening. So firstly, if I'd like the panel to come up, firstly, I'd like to welcome back Professor Nick Fox, who, as I said, is Director of the Dementia Research Centre at the University College London. But I've got two wonderful people to also invite to the stage. The first is Dr. Charles Marshall, who is a clinical senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London, a consultant neurologist who has been on call for the last 24 hours, who's also a dementia researcher focused on the impact of the social economic factors in dementia, and has got a lot of experience through his work in a memory clinic, so real on-the-ground frontline experience. And last but not least is our third and final panellist is Ripuljeet Kaur. Ripuljeet is a Black and minority ethnic dementia service coordinator at Touchstone, which is a mental health organisation. Ripuljeet has a wealth of experience within communities, supporting people on what is a really difficult dementia diagnosis journey for some points. So welcome to the panel. I hope you've all got microphones in front of you seamlessly as it's moving here. I feel like a little bit like Fiona Grease. Questions. Is this one on? You got me? Yes? I'll go back up here. Just like Fiona, I'll do it very seamlessly. Right. So Ripuljeet, welcome. I mean, we've touched on some of the voices that we heard earlier, but can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Ripuljeet Kaur, and I manage BME Dementia Service at Touchstone in Leeds. So we work closely with people with dementia and their carers from Black and ethnic minority communities. We provide that one-to-one support to people, where we signpost people to mainstream services, to dementia cafes, to provide that emotional support to people with dementia and their families and carers. We also have a dementia cafe for South Asian people with dementia and their carers, which is something we set up many years ago at Touchstone, where we saw the gap in services for people with dementia from ethnic minorities. So we have a dementia cafe on a weekly basis. We also have a music group for people with dementia, which is run in a mother tongue. And I'm quite involved strategically in Leeds, where I'm part of steering group for dementia-friendly Leeds. So on a dementia board, and I'm part of quite a few steering groups in Leeds around dementia work. And we've also won a Championing Diversity Award by Alzheimer Society back in 2018-19, I think. And I've been to Downing Street for work around dementia with BME community, so that's us.
That's wonderful. And we just had a snapshot of some of the voices of people affected by dementia. But what do you hear most from your communities that you work with on their experience of diagnosis?
I think it's quite mixed, as we've been listening to Nick as well and other speakers. I think it's difficult when you're from ethnic minorities, where you have additional barriers to access services. And seeing dementia as an illness is still a huge stigma. There's a huge stigma around it, just like any other mental health illnesses. So when people sometimes they'll go to GP and it'll be seen as, oh, it's something it's just, you're just not feeling, it's age related and you're getting old, it's normal, go back. And we've seen families where they've come back and had a diagnosis a couple of years later when they first visited their GP. But some of the GPs have been brilliant in Leeds, where they'll just go in, they'll do the test, and then they'll be sent to the memory services for a detailed memory test. And then from there, they'll go for a brain scan and have a diagnosis. But even then, it's quite a lengthy process from where first you go to the GP and then to get the diagnosis. But I think we can definitely do much better with the diagnosis, because if you don't speak English as a language, and even though we have memory tests where they're adapted to people who doesn't speak English first language, it's still quite difficult. Because I managed to go to one of the memory tests with one of our clients, and it was interesting because one of the questions they asked was name 4 seasons. It's quite straightforward, isn't it? For a lot, even in different languages, you'll have different seasons, but it's just about different names and how they see it. So she wasn't able to answer it correctly, but she knew it. So I think it comes down to how we are diagnosing people and what tools are we using. But we need to be really mindful about people who come from ethnic minorities, might have additional barriers to get diagnosis, to recognize the symptoms in the first place, because they'll see as an aging thing, like Nick mentioned in his presentation earlier. So they'll see, so you don't see right when you're getting old, you can't hear properly. So memory loss is quite common. So it's not seen as an illness. So that's why raising awareness of dementia is really, really important, especially with ethnic minority communities. So,
yeah, I mean, thank you. And I think that resonates with exactly what we hear at Alzheimer Society, and a big piece of work that we've done quite recently, looking at those barriers from different communities to get that diagnosis. And you're right, it's often down to, the relationship with a local kind of GP or primary care provider. So Charles, can I hand over to you, because you're working in memory clinics at the moment. So can you tell me a little bit about the work that you do, but also really interesting because we've got big disparities across the country in diagnosis, and maybe think through what some of the kind of differences and what the blocks are.
Yeah, thank you. So I sort of straddle 2 worlds, because I'm a neurology consultant and a dementia researcher. I should say that I was trained by Nick, and but I also go and work in a community memory clinic once a week in one of the most diverse and deprived boroughs in the country, and it is a different world. And some of the diagnostic tools that we've been hearing about just don't exist there. And what we see is what we heard about from Nick, that it's really important to have a clear diagnosis of a disease causing dementia, because it opens doors. It opens doors for you to understand what's causing your symptoms, to understand what the future might hold for you, but also to take part in research and to access treatments that we have now for symptoms, but treatments in the future that could stop or slow the progression of the disease. And there are large numbers of people still receiving diagnoses of unspecified dementia. And did you know that if the more deprived your postcode, the more likely you are to be diagnosed with unspecified dementia instead of a specified cause? So we have a real problem with equity, because people in some parts of the country that are more wealthy are more likely to have the tests that give them that specific diagnosis.
Yeah, and I, just exactly what you said reminded me. I was a scientific director for NHS London about 10 years ago, and you saw that significant disparity depending on where you were on the tube line across London. It was really quite stark, and I think shame on us that we're still in that position in this country. So what can we do to change that? Because that's where certainly Alzheimer Society is that force for change. How do we put our weight behind it? How can we create a much more equal access to diagnosis?
So I think there's 2 things. I think the first thing we have to do is persuade the people that design the services that it's actually really important to have a subtype diagnosis, because I don't think that it's necessarily a widely held view. I think we need to persuade commissioners that it's worth them funding services properly to have the tools to make those diagnoses. At the moment, all of the incentives are around diagnosing people with dementia, full stop. And I think we need to start measuring how often people are having a clear subtype diagnosis and incentivizing that. I think we need to recognize that getting a proper, accurate diagnosis takes a bit of time and care. and actually having arbitrary targets to give someone a dementia diagnosis in 6 weeks, when sometimes you just need to see them again in 6 months to get a clear idea of what's going on, to know that you're getting it right. We need services to be commissioned with that in mind, because lots of services are only commissioned to see somebody once, give them the diagnosis, and then discharge them and never see them again. So we need to be working with commissioners to help them understand what's important. But we also need to be providing the tools that can make those diagnoses in community memory clinic settings. So we saw those amazing pictures of brain scans, and Nick and I, when we see patients in clinic, we could sort of pore over the brain scan really carefully, trying to figure out what is happening in the brain. A majority of doctors working in memory clinics have no access to look at the scans. They can only see the report from the radiologists. That's an example. You know, some of the other things, PET scans are not available in most settings. Only 6% of memory clinics in the country have access to lumbar punctures or PET scans to give people a molecular diagnosis. And there are problems with using those things on the scale that would be required to have them in all memory clinics. But some of the exciting things we've heard about from Antoinette, blood tests could be done anywhere. So that's a really exciting prospect. But we need to show that they work in a real world memory clinic setting, and that hasn't been done yet. And we heard from Ash about the potential for AI, and that's something that's really exciting, because, you know, the looking at the difference between the slices of parsnips is really difficult for the human eye, but potentially really well suited to a computer vision solution. So, you know, a piece of software that could figure out what's going on better from the scans that people are already having and give a more accurate diagnosis is a really good example of something that could be scaled up and used in any memory clinic setting. So those are the sorts of things that we need to be.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, everything you've said just resonates with, I think, where we've seen massive changes in things like cancer. You've got that. And, you know, we just don't have really good data that shows what's happening across the dementia pathway. And the government is looking at a new dementia strategy that we're expecting out in the early summer. And one of the things that we're calling on is a national dementia observatory, so we can properly track from rather what a quite a crude diagnosis rate is to really accurately how many people with Alzheimer's disease, how many people with the different subtypes as you've described. So Mike and Nick, welcome back. I mean, there's so much that we could talk about here, but you know, one of the things that we did touch upon is how badly people affected by dementia have been affected by the pandemic. But it's not just that, it is those tens of thousands of people that are waiting now to get that diagnosis. Our diagnosis rates have dropped. We know that there is massive wait lists to get into memory assessment clinics. And you know, Charlie, you work there. I mean, people in the NHS have been working incredibly hard for the last 2 years, but we know that we've got many, many barriers to getting this dementia pathway right. So what do we do, Nick? How can we push, you know, for really getting that diagnosis rate back to where it needs to be, but actually more importantly, to ensure that dementia is taken as seriously as other conditions such as cancer? You might have heard Savage Javid have a war on cancer, another war on cancer. You know, what do we do to get that back up the agenda?
I think, I mean, it's a really tough question. I mean, I think it's hard to understate how different the approach certainly has been. There are 2-week waits for cancer diagnosis, and we have to change how both the public and the medical profession feel about the importance of making a diagnosis. Everybody gets really worried about missing a cancer. But the opposite happens in dementia. People worry about diagnosing it too wrongly or too early. And there's a complete change that we need to make there. We need to go out and we need to campaign and really push the government. What's really shocking is all the costs of dementia to the economy, which is 26 billion or something like that. They're all entirely about care. Almost nothing goes on the diagnosis, almost nothing goes on research. So out of every £10 that's spent on care, mainly residential care, and a huge amount that families go through caring for people beyond when they should be without any support, that 26 billion, if you think about the proportion, for every £10 that goes on that support, it's about less than 1 pence goes on research, and not much more goes on actually the medical treatment. It's like there's a great hole in the roof and the rain's pouring through, we're just moving buckets around. we've got to really change and not just mop up afterwards. Sorry, long-winded, but it's something that does matter, how we change that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we know is that having that timely diagnosis, when you're ready to get that diagnosis, opens up that really good post-diagnostic support. And that actually saves money further down the line. So you're going to be able to avoid hospital admissions from things like falls or urinary tract infections because you've got a good care package. But equally, you know, people being stuck in hospital, the kind of delayed discharge, if you've got that really good care package. So we need to think more, more system-wide on this, and that's a big part of my team's work over the coming months. So back to you, Charles. I mean, in the video, small snapshots that we heard, and we've heard from Ripplejit, that the experience of getting a diagnosis is not always as great as we would want it to be, and it is going to be life-changing, it's going to be devastating, but there is something about how we give that and do that in a really good way. So what do you think are the key things that we can do to improve the experience of getting a diagnosis?
So I think we've heard from Nick about all the reasons why it's better to have a diagnosis. And having a diagnosis is empowering. It allows you to access treatment and support. It allows you to take part in research. And I think we need to be better at emphasizing that. And I think that lots of kind of negative stories around diagnosis are when people are delivered the diagnosis and then told, well, that's it. There's nothing else to say. There's nothing else to do. So I think being very clear about the kind of proactive things that you can do by virtue of having a diagnosis. I mean, you can't get away from the fact that it's bad news, but it has to come with some kind of proactive steps that you can take to make it not feel like a terribly negative experience. And one of the things that's really helpful for that is that we have advisors from the Alzheimer Society in our clinic with us, and so we get them involved to help describe some of those proactive steps that people can take. And when we have a disease-modifying treatment available, that will shift entirely, because that will really be the end of the kind of nihilism that we need to avoid.
Yeah, and I think this piece, this is one of the reasons that I am just so proud to be at Alzheimer Society, because not only are we being this push and force for change for the future, and have been for 30 years, but actually we are the people that are going to help you through this. We will hold your hand from the moment you're worried about your memory through to getting that diagnosis and helping you through that post-diagnostic support. And that actually is one of the biggest moments of crisis for families, is that coming to terms with and then looking out and trying to seek that support. So,
and one of the amazing things that the Alzheimer's Society does in that context is, you have a clinic appointment and you always then suddenly think of lots of questions you wish to ask the doctor afterwards. And so we arrange for someone from the Alzheimer's Society to get in touch, the next day. And that's when suddenly you have all the questions and there's somebody who's an expert who can answer them. It's an amazing resource.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Ripplejit, back to you, because I'd really like to talk about these sort of different communities. I mean, what do you think needs to be done to ensure that everyone understands that a dementia diagnosis is that really important first step to accessing the support that's needed?
I think what we've done so often, we've been running this project for nearly 10 years now. And one of the things we really focused from the very start was to raise awareness of dementia, because a lot of people wouldn't have heard of dementia, because in 5 South Asian languages, there's no word for dementia. And the closest one would be madness, crazy. And you can see how stigmas is huge when it comes to dementia. So I think, coming back to your question, I think it's important to work with communities, work with faith groups, go into the group settings and talk about dementia symptoms and what the diagnosis pathway is in your own towns, and then explaining the impact of dementia on just not on the person with dementia, and also on the family members. So it affects the whole family, and going forward, what the future looks like. So it really is important to educate people around dementia and the impact of dementia on the families. What that would do is, because this is something we've started doing, is we started talking about power of attorney when we first go see people, and just talk about the finances and Mental Capacity Act. It's just so people are aware what their options are, even though having that diagnosis, we know sometimes it's could be a really big thing for the families, and they just want to don't want to know anything else at that point. But giving that information to people, then they know, we can just go back to these people, like, we talked about advisors. In Leeds, we have memory support workers, and then they can go back to these professionals and get the information when they need it, when they're ready. So this is how I think people will start looking at dementia from different perspectives. It's not just about, okay, it's dementia, we have a diagnosis, we've got Alzheimer's disease, that's it. But what would happen in the future? So I think that would really push people for early diagnosis.
That's wonderful. Now I want to come back to Nick, because I have to say, I as a clinician who was a clinical scientist who led laboratories doing lots of blood tests and bringing new blood tests in, I've always been struck by what Antoinette is doing. So Nick, what's your thoughts? How ready is the NHS to embed new tests, new techniques, particularly the simple blood tests that Antoinette talks about, so that essentially that they're cost effective and widely available?
Well, the NHS is a very slow-moving organisation sometimes, but I think the last couple of years has shown how fast it can respond. And I think if you asked me the same question and said we didn't have blood tests, how lumbar punctures are also give you great diagnostic value. If you ask me, could the NHS gear up to do that, it would be years, decades. I think actually, if we push, I think blood tests really do have potential to be made pretty rapidly, more widely available. More generally, the NHS and our systems are poorly set up for the pace of change. If we get a disease-modifying therapy tomorrow, it's going to have massive change in the NHS to deal with that. But it certainly would drive improvement in diagnostics.
Yeah. And I think in some ways COVID may help us in this, because having previously been the pathology advisor for NHS England, diagnostics even 3 years ago really wasn't top of the priority list, which kind of showed you why we weren't ready with all the testing that was needed as we kind of went into the COVID crisis. But actually that has changed. We've now, as a nation, I think, recognise how testing can change the way you understand whether you've got a disease and what you need to do next. It's the signalling system. So I feel more hopeful now than I did 3 years ago that if these blood tests are shown to be really effective, particularly in primary care with GPs, I think there will be a whole army kind of coming behind it. So Ribble-G, just kind of back to you for kind of the final question before I kind of open it up to others, is that even when we get these research breakthroughs, those kind of diagnostics, those tests being widely available, how do we get the right support and tailored to the communities that you support? Because you talked about some of the real barriers. What does good support look like for South Asian communities that you facilitate? And why can't we do it in all the communities that need it?
I think, like I mentioned before, that people from ethnic minorities, most people would have some sort of barriers or stigma. There's, all those taboos around dementia. But when people are from ethnic minorities, they have additional barriers. So, for example, language. So when somebody has dementia diagnosis, they would revert back to their mother tongue. So if they've learned English as a second language when they first came to this country, so they'll revert back to their mother tongue. And by that, so I've actually had a client where she was a head teacher here, but since her dementia diagnosis, she reverted back to her mother tongue. So she just lost her English completely. So that's one of the barriers. So then looking at cultural needs, religious needs of people. So I think it's really important to be inclusive of all communities when we are thinking of setting up services, groups or anything. So we have, before COVID happened, we had about over 70 dementia cafes in Leeds. But then we saw the gap in services where so our dementia cafe is a South Asian dementia cafe. So if you think about dementia and how it impacts on a person with dementia, so there's a language need. So if they would have gone to any other cafe, all the activities they were running were around, the history of this country and the anything to do with this country. But when you've got dementia and you go back to, you're back in time, and so all your memories would be from your home country. So what we do in our dementia cafes, we tailor all of our activities around cultural and language needs of the people who come to the cafe. Just a quick examples like bingo. Everybody loves the game of bingo. But what we did was, so we adapted bingo to like fruits and veg from the South Asian background, so like ginger, garlic, and all that in the mother tongue language. So, and they love it. It's just, we don't have to always spend a lot of money to be inclusive of other communities. It's just about being creative and knowing the needs of people. So if you're aware of cultural needs of people, religious needs of people, and the language needs, you can always adapt your services and activities accordingly. So I think it's really crucial, it's important, because then people feel left out. There's huge gaps in services when it comes to people from ethnic minorities, because they just can't go to any group, especially if you have Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. So your needs would be different from others, because if you're going into group and you can't interact or you can't understand anything, if I start speaking Punjabi because that's my mother tongue, nobody would understand what I'm saying. So if you think about a person with dementia going into group setting and everybody's, you know, having a good time, speaking their language, and they're like, okay, what am I supposed to be doing here? So I think it's really, really, I can't stress enough on having inclusive services for people from all communities.
And I think what you're highlighting is the need for that real personalised support, in the same way as you were talking about how really accurate diagnosis enables you to have personalised treatment. Actually, it's about tailoring both the care and treatments to the individuals. And we see that in cancer.
Yes.
But that's, as you say, Nick, that's the kind of big leap forward that we need to make within dementia. So just before we kind of open it up to questions from the floor, quick each, what do you think is the top challenge in dementia diagnosis that we need to desperately tackle? Do you want to go first?
I would say is early diagnosis is really crucial. And I think that's down to raising awareness of dementia within communities. So that's the main one for me.
Wonderful.
I think that, echoing something Nick said, we need to start getting our services ready now for the arrival of a disease-modifying treatment that completely shifts the landscape. We need to be preparing for that already.
Yeah.
I think changing attitudes is probably most, but blood tests may help.
Yeah, wonderful. So we're going to move it to opening it up to questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite Antoinette and Ashwin to join us again. We've hopefully got some questions from the floor and also some questions online. So anybody like to open the questions in the audience tonight? Don't be shy. Richard. Oh, have we got a mic for you?
So I'm not normally people normally say I'm too loud rather than the other way around, but yeah, we are being recorded. Okay. So thanks very much everybody for, I think, a really stimulating evening and very inspirational actually, because, you know, again, you know, we've talked about this before, Fiona, about the maybe not having the right level of understanding about just what advances are being made and the progress that has been made. And that, I think that's been really invigorating for me. So thank you very much, everybody. But just the question I had on the notion of diagnosis, and we've heard a lot this evening about early diagnosis and how important that is for all sorts of reasons, not just for those individuals, but also for our ability to track and to test and to try different therapies and things to see what would work and what wouldn't. Do you think there's a major blockage to that in the mindset the population has about dementia, and the fact that not many people are going to want to get told that they're pre-symptomatic, and therefore are we going to have enough people or access to enough people, even if the techniques, and we were able to do blood tests, you know, in the GP surgery or in any other medical establishment? Do you think that's going to be a blocker for us to make progress? So I suppose that's a societal, individual attitude point more than anything else.
Yeah, wonderful, Richard. Nick, do you want to take that start off?
Yeah, I don't actually think there is a place for the moment for pre-symptomatic diagnosis. I think it's like screening for breast cancer, that we only do it when we can really make a difference to people. I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I mean, some people have a different view. People try and seek diagnosis, you know, in their 30s, 40s, and when they're perfectly well. I actually think if there isn't something you can do about it, much like we decide about screening, we shouldn't be putting that in systems. What we need to do is respond when people want a diagnosis. And even though there is sometimes it's a devastating diagnosis to receive, in my experience, but people are, when they come and they've already got symptoms, they know something's wrong, or not necessarily them, but their families do. And they do really want to know what's going on. So I think that once you've got symptoms, it's a whole different ball game when we have disease-modifying therapies, because we definitely will want to start earlier.
So I think it's that bit about from the moment you're worried about your memory, that actually that's the time to come through. And we know, we've talked about stigma, that we know that there's lots of challenges, there's lots of myths that it's just aging, it's not an illness. And that's something as an organisation we're going to be really leaning into over the coming months, particularly around Dementia Action Week, because we know, and we've got very strong evidence now, that for people who've been recently diagnosed, they are so pleased that they have that diagnosis. Very, very strong evidence that the significant majority are pleased that they got that diagnosis. But as Nick says, actually the earlier that you get it, once you have that symptoms, opens up a wealth of possibilities around treatments as they come through, and the opportunity to become part of clinical trials and become part of research as well. And again, that's where you're seeing cancer, for example, and other diseases. That's the shift that we need to see within dementia. I think there was a question at the back, and then I'll go to a question online.
Yeah, just to follow up really to that point. I mean, obviously the diagnosis is devastating, but the impact on the carers is also devastating and on their families as well. So that early diagnosis could make a massive difference, because you would change your whole outlook and the way that you're dealing with, in my case, my parents, and the way that my father would have dealt with my mother. And we probably, if we'd have known earlier, I'd have physically moved them from where they are now. So that early diagnosis, I'm just maybe coming back to that point. If we could screen people, and I don't know, the familial study was fascinating, actually. My grandmother actually had dementia. We didn't know that. I didn't know that, but I know that now. And obviously my mother has, and then there'll be a risk through the family. So I think there could be a huge amount that could be done. I just wonder what you think about that. Could you turn that on its head? And if we could get that diagnosis around the country, I mean, is it about 10% of the people over 65 are going to have dementia soon? Why don't we do that?
It's an absolutely fair point, and it's really reasonable for you to push back. And so maybe we should take a straw poll, because I think it's so the public health people always say, well, you shouldn't do screening unless you've got something to offer. But people's views differ, and as you say, some people want to know. A really interesting thing is when genes are found for the causative of things like Alzheimer's disease, you might think everybody would want to know. About 20% of people choose to get a predictive genetic test. 80% of people think, actually, I'm okay now, I won't do it. If it's going to do something, if you're going to change what you do, like choose children or not with a gene, that's different. But I don't know. Would people want to know ahead of time in the room?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And in a past life, I was the director of screening, actually. And this bit about, if you go down the route, it's about do no harm. So actually, the implication of finding out can be really significant, which is why particularly the UK takes, global leading actually, but a very cautious view in terms of what we will bring in terms of national screening programs. But to be honest, we've got a huge amount to do around the symptomatic piece, and that needs to be kind of tackled and done now. Comments from the floor. Have we got any questions, Laura, online?
Yep. So our first question is, what are some of the features you think make up the gold standard of diagnosis? If there was no cap on budget or resource, what would this look like?
Antoinette, do you want to take that one? Money, no object.
One can dream.
Is that one?
Third time lucky.
That's it.
So yeah, I think in a gold standard, it's when somebody first starts to worry. As you've mentioned a lot about cancer pathways, and I think there's a lot to learn from the way cancer services are set up. There's 2-week wait, so you're getting an early access. You're getting a targeted diagnosis, like we mentioned earlier, not this dementia not specified. You're getting a targeted diagnosis. This is what we think the underlying disease is. These are, what the features you should expect. These are the support groups you have access to. These are the symptomatic treatments. These are the research studies you can participate in. these are the clinical trials. No, it shouldn't be, here's your diagnosis, goodbye. It should be, here are the things that you can do now, and you shouldn't be waiting for that diagnosis to be the things
I think that's just spot on the money, Antoinette. And actually, I mean, I think this is part of what we're trying to do at Alzheimer's Society is, this is doable. This has been done for other disease. And part of what we're trying to do is to get the government to see that dementia, exactly as Nick has described, is not part of old age. It is actually a pathology and it is a disease. And we need to start thinking about it in that way. And interestingly, from a new government strategy coming out, some of the things we're trying to do is get in those learnings from cancer, because we know some of the big steps forward were around having that dementia observatory, so we were able to properly understand what dementia looks like across the country. But interestingly, a patient experience survey, because I think once we actually properly understand the experience that individuals and families are having, I think that would shock the whole of society into action. So for us, they're two of the key cornerstones of this transformation to get to where you've described, Antoinette. Laura, anything else from online?
Yep. So another question. We've heard a lot about what the scientific community and research can do to deliver improvements in diagnosis, but what can ordinary people do to help make this positive change?
Ripplecheek, would you like to take that?
I think Dementia Friends, I think, is a really good campaign. I know that's changing a little bit now, but because I am a dementia champion, so from my work, I've been delivering Dementia Friends sessions within my community settings out of work. And what I've seen is like, what I say to people is when we are aware about the illness, any type of illness, and how it impacts on the person, and then you can support those people better. So like if somebody would come to you, ask you the same question 3 times, if you don't know that they've got dementia and probably that's why they're doing this, you'll probably start getting annoyed a little bit, trying to ignore them. But if you're aware that they've got this illness and it's okay for them to ask you 3-4 times the same question, and that would make a huge difference, because you'll see people in towns, you'll meet people at parties or weddings, and for these people who have diagnosis of dementia, any type of dementia, if they should feel comfortable going into any settings without being judged, or even their family members thinking, okay, I know of people who would avoid family functions just because they just won't feel comfortable taking their mom and dad or their partner to these settings, because they might not understand it and they might create a scene and others wouldn't understand. So I think, as coming back to the question, I think it's important to what we can do as a community, not through work as a profession, but wherever we could, maybe just raise awareness about the disease and how it impacts on people. It's really important. It will make a huge difference to a lot of people out there who wouldn't go to any groups, any day centers, or they're staying home, probably go to supermarket once a week. But for others to understand this illness better would really help them feel comfortable going out and just be themselves. Probably, I think that's what I could tell you from my
No, I think that's just wonderful. I think that awareness, that support, and being a dementia friend is a really positive, quite straightforward step to take. I'd also say, if this has really fired you up, we've got over 130,000 campaigners who've been extraordinary in the last 2 years. They have pushed forward social care reform last year, and we are really focusing on diagnosis this year. So again, I'm sure the team will be able to send you out the links to joining us as a campaigner as well. Laura, anything else from the film, and then we'll go back into the audience.
So Emma has asked, what learning can we take, or are we taking, from diagnosis research or clinical practice for diabetes and cancer?
Oh, interesting question. Who would like to take that one? Charles, I'm looking at you. What can we learn from diabetes and cancer?
I think not enough. I mean, I think that they're different, as we've heard, because they're things for which we have good disease-modifying treatments, and so that is really, some decades ago, lit a fire under everybody to find better ways of diagnosing them in a timely manner, and that we need to start preparing for that, because we're almost there, and so now is the time to be learning those lessons properly. to be thinking about how we build that kind of practice. And it would be completely unacceptable to say to somebody, you think you might have cancer, there's this amazing scanner 4 miles down the road that could tell you that, but you're not going to go there. You're going to go to this other hospital that can't access that scanner. I mean, it would be a scandal. And so we need to start viewing the inequity in dementia services as a scandal, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we know is that we've got nice guidance around diagnosis for dementia, and we've done a piece of work in the last year that shows huge differences across the country in whether you get access to the CSF testing across the country. So I think again, this is something that is just so important for all of us, for professionals, for clinicians, for supporters, for families to say, now is the time. It's really not good enough. So into the room, any more questions in the room? A colleague, a friend at the back?
A question for Antoinette. So you talk about blood biomarkers. When do you think that the validation is going to be at the position that's going to be able to be fully available? And do you see it leapfrogging CSF, or do you see it as a triage tool and that you'll still need CSF or PET?
They're really good questions. So, I think if at the start even of my research in 2017, if you had told me that I'd be presenting here saying that, I had worked on 2 studies that showed really very promising results in blood biomarkers, have been like, oh no, you're having me on. So I think, we've made huge progress in such a short period of time. And I would say also what's really exciting is this isn't just work coming out of our group. We've seen the same results with studies all across the world. So other familial Alzheimer's disease cohorts have shown the exact same changes at the exact same times. And similarly, they've been replicated in sporadic Alzheimer's disease cohorts. So there's really good replication out there in research communities. And it's what Charlie mentioned earlier. It's about moving it now into real world community memory settings. And we just need that research. And then I think, it's a really exciting time. And it can, I think it's going to move really rapidly. So I think, that curve is going to continue. And I think it's an exciting time. And I can see it, moving forward and being accessible in the computer in the future, in the not too distant future. About whether it will need reliable, additional confirmation. I think some of the tests could be potentially GP screening tests, but we need to see how these blood tests perform in research studies in memory clinics before we can say they're sufficient, or whether they will need confirmatory testing. And I think that needs a little bit more fine phenotyping, but I know those studies are ongoing, and I think we will have that information in the not too distant future.
So can I build on that? Because I think what you're saying is just so important, that we need to now try this in real world setting, because, with the greatest respect to all of you, you work in amazing global leading centres, and that's why we're funding the best people. But how do we make this a reality in some of the kind of far reaches of our country that might not be linked to a really significant academic centre? I mean, I don't know whether Ash, you want to comment on the reality of what it's like day to day in some of these mental health trusts and community member assessment clinics.
I think the day-to-day reality, even if you are working at a leading institution, actually just walk a couple of streets down the road and actually you see the inequalities within London itself, and you do a home visit and you see how far removed it is from a cutting-edge memory service with access to everything. I think it's a huge problem. There's a huge mismatch. There are people I've seen in the last week and done home visits on who are very deprived. English isn't their first language. There are so many hurdles to overcome. Food and drink and the cost of living is hard enough for them, let alone precision diagnostics. I'm not sure what the solution is to bridge those two worlds. I'm hopeful that a solution will come in the future where we can have accessible and scalable measures that are translatable to wider populations and reach all corners. And it's not necessarily all corners geographically, it's everyone. And particularly what we need is disproportionate access to those most in need. So we need to focus and almost have some kind of assertive outreach system to target people who wouldn't normally go through the traditional routes, and then entice them to get precision diagnosis and full care and do most of our research and shift the field a little bit by researching those vulnerable groups. But I don't know what the solution is.
No, I mean, one opportunity we have is the government has agreed to double dementia research. It was a manifesto commitment, and that kind of opens the door around the research element. But you can't do that without the transformation of the NHS services. So that's why the government new strategy is really important and something that we are at the heart of, at the table, pushing on. Laura, back to the people at home.
Yeah, so the next question, Nick, Ash and Antoinette all mentioned how essential families participating in research and clinical trials were to breakthroughs. How do we encourage more people to do this?
Who would like to take that? Antoinette, do you want to take that one?
So I think, there's been really great, there's increasing awareness, and I think there's been great sites, like there's a joint dementia research website that's been really helpful for allowing anyone to participate in research, and that's a really helpful resource. It's a website where you can put in your details and say, this is who I am and this is the story, and then researchers can go on that and see, okay, this person is a perfect fit for my study. It's sort of like a dementia research version of Tinder in some respects, but you get to match up, and I think that's a really great innovation, because anyone around the country can join that. You don't have to be just in a specific catchment area. So they're really important ways of doing things, and I think also some of it is on the onus of us as clinicians, when people are getting their diagnosis, when people are coming to us, saying, highlighting these research avenues and saying there are participation in research. And we know that people who participate in research do well and do better, even if there isn't a treatment, just by that contact, being closely involved, seeing people. So it's really important in and of itself. And that hope is really important, I think, and that feeling that you're contributing and able to help future generations. And definitely, having worked with these amazing families, that's the feedback we give. These people are so kind. They're like, they never say it's for themselves. It's always like, this is for the future. This is for, my children. This is for future generations. And I think, I've been so lucky to work with these families, and it's been a real privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I just couldn't agree with all of that more, Antoinette. Joint dementia research is an extraordinary opportunity for everybody, democratising research to get involved, whether you have dementia diagnosis, whether you're a family carer, or whether you are someone sitting in this room tonight, because the biggest barrier we have got to clinical trials and breakthroughs is numbers of people recruited into clinical trials, because it takes so long to get those numbers. And I think particularly going back to the points that Ash and Ripplejeet were making, and we need to have a diversity of people joining dementia research. We can't just go to the normal communities that we often reach into. So a huge opportunity, I think, for everybody tonight to take a positive step forward. So I'm just going to go to final questions. Any last questions in the room? Martin?
Can I just ask if there was such thing as a sort of a global, if there was such a thing as a global league table, and be that in terms of government funding or diagnostic rates, or the level of healthcare support for Alzheimer's and so on, where would the UK rank, and which are the countries that you would regard as being sort of the gold standard here, if there is such a thing?
Do you want to take it, Nick?
Yeah, I can make a start at that. I think that maybe that's fine. Yeah, I don't know. So there's lots of different bits in that question. It's a good one, though. The approach to diagnosis, particularly in some parts of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and also the amount of support, is frankly better. And it's I'm a tremendous believer in the NHS, and it pains me to say that. In the States, if you're rich and you've got money, you can get a fantastic diagnostic, but then huge proportions of people in the US totally miss the system. So that was on the diagnosis. You talked to the other things you were asking about. Was that also about care and support? Yeah, it's about care and support systems that are in place. Well, again, if I can draw the parallel with Scandinavia, when the very first symptomatic therapies, that they're not wonder drugs, came out, One of the things that drives the NHS is if something saves the government money. That won't be a shock to anybody here. Irrespective of quality of life improvements, if it saves money. And one of the first studies looking at these new tablets that came out that help with symptoms, but they don't slow the disease. People couldn't see a cost saving in the UK, but they could in Scandinavia. So did they have different Alzheimer's over there? No, it's because actually people struggle on in families looking after their loved one without any cost incurred by the society because they don't get the support and they go into residential care very late. And in other parts of the world, it goes earlier. So if you can keep people out of residential care, that's what really drives the government because that saves a lot of money. Sorry.
But I think this piece about unpaid carers is so important because, you know, we've seen this not only through the pandemic but before. I mean, it's unpaid family carers because we've not been able to. People aren't able to access the support that they need from the local authorities. Exactly as you've described, Antoinette. You get your diagnosis within a memory assessment clinic, and then next steps, there's very little care and support. So a huge amount for us to do, but I have to say that there's no doubt that with the supporters, with our partners, with the energy and drive of Alzheimer's Society, you know, we are going to tackle this. We're going after it. So one final question at the back, and then I will wrap up.
Economic case, which in my view is pretty obvious.
So we do. I would say that I think one of the interesting opportunities we've got is there's a new government policy called integrated care, which means that health and social care budgets are being pooled, and then you can start to make the argument that doing something good in the NHS will save you money in local authorities. So again, there is opportunity and something that we are really facing into. So I'm conscious of time. I want to say thank you. I mean, a fantastic conversation. We've gone from everything from kind of cutting edge machine learning, artificial intelligence, right through to the kind of reality on the ground here today. But thank you so much to each and every one of you. And if we can show our appreciation. So the progress that we heard of tonight is absolutely and utterly down to all of our supporters. From Nick's breakthrough discovery nearly 30 years ago, and didn't you love his picture of him in the early 90s? I will dig out my photograph of a baby biochemist in 1993. I think I'll match you with my very bad curly perm at that time. But going back to the 90s, right through to the kind of the prospect and the hope that Antoinette and Ashwin's research show us. But there's a lot more that we need to do, and I think we started to touch on some of that this evening. The dream scenario for early and accurate diagnosis and those new treatments feels in touching distance, but we've got a lot to do to get that diagnosis right, to unlock the support and that hope that future will create. So our task at Alzheimer's Society is to make those breakthroughs and discoveries possible, and that can only be achieved through dementia research and wonderful people like the academics we've heard from tonight. We, through the Alzheimer's Society, uncover those vital pieces of the puzzle, but they have a really important direct influence on our ongoing policy and campaigning work. And it is no surprise that that's why my portfolio is both research and influencing, because we need the expertise, we need the understanding, we need that lived experience to get the government to stand up and listen. So by powering that vital research, our supporters really can create lasting change for people affected by dementia. So if you'd like tonight to make a donation towards the work of Alzheimer's Society and our world-leading researchers like Nick and Antoinette and Ashwin, then you can do so. If you're at home, there is a donation link, but also a QR code on page 10 of your programme. So just simply use your camera on your phone. But there's a lot other ways that you can help us. You can ask to be part of Joint Dementia Research. Again, it's in your programmes, more information there. You can become part of our campaigners and really raise the roof on the absolute injustice and inequality of what is happening around dementia at the moment. But you can also pledge in terms of either leaving a gift in your will or other forms of really giving out your support to us all. So just finally, just a couple of things for me, a bit of a heads up. Any football fans in the audience here tonight, please look out on the 26th of March to the England-Switzerland International. We have been awarded the FA partnership for 2 years. It's so exciting for us. And we're going to be all over that England International that'll be on the television. So please do look out for us then. But also a lot more activity, really speaking about some of these issues around awareness, busting that myth that dementia is a normal part of ageing. We're going to be doing that during Dementia Action Week, and I know the teams will be sending you out links because there's lots of ways in which you can get involved. But finally, I did want to thank everybody, not only here tonight, but also online. For those of you here tonight, it's just wonderful to see you all, to see friends that we haven't seen for such a long time, to meet new friends. So please do stay behind. And I have to say, and I honestly do believe this genuinely, your support is really making a difference. Right from Nick's first research fellowship 30 years ago to the brilliant young researchers you've heard from tonight, we can make a real difference. We can really push to have those hopes for breakthroughs in diagnosis and treatments. So we can all do that together. So thank you so much for coming this evening. And please stay behind for a glass of wine, and at home, go and top up your glasses. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Honestly, what a good night. Really good discussion.